No. Sorry. Hi, Nicola. Are we going to start right away? Am I audible? Okay, perfect. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Welcome to the 12-hour Global Climate Justice Conference on Navigating the Climate Emergency, the Role of International Courts and Advisory Opinions. This event takes place in recognition of the ongoing efforts to obtain advisory opinions before the International Court of Justice, the International American Court of Human Rights, and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. The advisory opinions from these international courts have the power to spark large advancements in climate justice globally, and efforts like these make us optimistic that we can turn the tide within the next 5 years. We invite you to join us as we delve into the critical role of international courts and advisory opinions in addressing the urgent challenges posed by the climate emergency. Needless to say, we have many global experts joining today with various backgrounds and experiences who will discuss how legal frameworks can drive global climate action and promote fair solutions for a sustainable future. This all will unfold within a 12-hour time frame, making the webinar a climate justice trip around the world in 12 hours. The conferences consists of 6 main sessions, with 1 session dedicated to each of the following regions: the Pacific, South and Southeast Asia, Africa, Europe, the Caribbean, and the Latin America. This is the regional session for South and Southeast Asia on the theme Human Rights Violations in the Context of Climate Change and Applicable Law, organized by the Asian Front of the World's Youth for Climate Justice in collaboration with the Center for Climate Justice, Bangladesh. I am Dulki Sitavakar, the Deputy Front Convener for WYCJ Asia and the moderator for this session. This session will consist of a panel discussion on human rights violations in the context of climate change and applicable law, followed by a question and answer session. We are so honored to be joined by our esteemed group of panelists from Sri Lanka, India, and the Philippines. We warmly welcome Professor Kokila Konasinghe, Mr. Dennis Mombawa, Mr. Harjit Singh, and Ms. Christine Joy Argola. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the members of the Bangladesh WYCJ National Front, including Momita, and the Center for Climate Justice Bangladesh for their hard work in planning and organizing this session. Unfortunately, they are unable to join us today, but we extend our heartfelt thanks and pray for their safety during this challenging period. Without further ado, let me invite the first speaker today to share his insights. Mr. Harjit Singh is an activist advocating for climate and social justice globally. His work has involved assisting countries in responding to disasters, climate impacts, migration, and in bolstering adaptation and resilience programs. Harjit has co-founded Satat Sampada, a social enterprise dedicated to promoting sustainable environmental practices such as organic food and farming in India and beyond. He is also the Global Engagement Director at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. Previously, he served as the Head of Global Political Strategy at Climate Action Network CAN International and led Action Aid's climate justice work globally. Harjit has been a board member of both CAN International and the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction. Currently, he is also a member of the United Nations Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management under the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. He has authored and overseen numerous publications in the field of climate justice and disaster resilience. He tweets at Harjit11. Today, he will be speaking on intergenerational equity and human rights-based climate action. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Such a pleasure to connect and speak in this context of how we are going to look at intergenerational equity and human rights-based action, something that I have been associated for a long time. And I must mention, Dulki, as you introduced in ActionAid, in fact, our entry into the climate space was from a human rights perspective, going way beyond environmental impacts. So let me share a few thoughts to set the context, and I'll be very happy to have a more interactive mode of this conversation. We all know that we are already living in a world which is 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer, something which we had put as our target in Paris Agreement. We know it's temporary, but we also recognize how emissions have been continuously rising and how impacts on ecosystems and human societies have increased as global warming has led to climate change, which is a global crisis that is threatening our own well-being and survival of many species and flora and fauna on the planet. We also see how climate change is displacing millions and is projected to displace many more millions by the end of the century. And the poverty gains that we made over the last few decades are now being undone by climate change, as there are estimates that there are going to be at least additional 100 million people will be pushed into poverty by 2030. That's the kind of impact we are seeing. So as sea levels rise and extreme weather events become far more frequent, we also see how food insecurity has increased. And I already mentioned how displacement is causing not only social, but also economic challenges for communities. Now, in this context, we need to look at it from intergenerational equity perspective, something that is very well enshrined in numerous international agreements and declaration, particularly Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you look at Article 3, it talks about right to life. And we look at Article 25, where there's a clear mention of right to adequate standard of living, which we know is now getting impacted because of climate change. And there are many other relevant articles which can connect to how human rights violation is being caused by increased global warming and climate change impacts. Then International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Articles 11 and 12, which talk about right to food and right to health, respectively, are particularly important. Again, so many impacts are happening on people's life in terms of their inability to access food adequately and also health impacts that they are facing. We also can connect how UN guiding principles on business and human rights hold businesses accountable. And this is particularly relevant in the context of climate change, as we know how more than 70% of emissions have come from barely 100 companies. And so that data is a couple of years old, and the recent one says now it's just 80 companies which are responsible for more than 80% of emissions that are happening. So clearly, the violations that are happening in terms of people being impacted, as I mentioned, various aspects of their life and their rights being violated, we have to look at it from the perspective of human rights violation and how intergenerational equity is absolutely fundamental in protecting the rights of future generations to a healthy and sustainable environment. So it is on one hand legal obligation, but also moral. And that's where current generations in terms of society as well as businesses and governments have a role to protect future generations who will inherit a world that is going to be habitable, that's going to be conducive to human flourishing. And that's the responsibility we have. And also our obligations extend way beyond our national borders. And that's why when we talk about fighting climate change, our efforts cannot be domestic. And that's why many of these international processes are extremely important. Now, as we talk about intergenerational rights, so it's not just the current generation and especially people of my age in 40s and 50s and beyond. We have seen how we are also being challenged by young people who are worldwide leading the charge for climate action, and they have really been holding governments and corporations to account and pushing them to take urgent measures to protect their futures. And the movement from the Pacific, we are seeing larger movement of Fridays for Future, and particularly people from affected nations who are most affected communities. They have been bringing forth some of these issues. And in the context of how fossil fuels are responsible for climate change, and much of our energy continues to remain dependent, demanding a just transition that can ensure sustainable future, and particularly highlighting the intergenerational dimension of climate change is extremely important. We've also seen that if we really want to achieve our human rights, we cannot just depend on advocacy, and that's where legal framework and legal action becomes extremely important. And we have seen how climate litigation is on the rise globally, and we have seen how cases have increased or multiplied over the last few years, particularly invoking intergenerational equity and human rights argument. And there are many cases we have seen, be it Urgenda Foundation case in Netherlands, where it was successfully argued that government's inadequate policies are violating human rights of present and future generations. And we have seen many such cases also in Asia. Again, since this is a conversation about Asia, we should also look at how many cases that are happening in Philippines, in Pakistan, in India, that have actually demanded much more action from their respective governments, and which in turn are going to put pressure on the international system. So I'm sure you're aware about the case in the Philippines where Greenpeace was involved, and the case was started in 2015. Similarly, the case in Pakistan in 2015, and there's another case in 2020 now. Similarly, in India, there was a case by a 9-year-old in 2017, and there's another case in 2019. We have seen in Indonesia, Friends of the Earth challenged the Ministry of Environment and Forestry in 2019, and there's another case by Indonesian Forum for the Environment in 2021. Again, there are similar cases in South Korea and beyond. So we are seeing many more cases again from the rights-based perspective. And that rights-based litigation increasing is a good sign, where you see particularly young people getting involved, but taking a more whole of the society role where people engaged and challenge their governments. They're also demanding various other measures at various levels in terms of policy action, be it environmental impact assessments or corporate accountability, which we know are absolutely key. So at this moment where we see governments not taking sufficient action at various levels, young people have taken up the leadership, and again, putting the international intergenerational equity and human rights at the center. Looking at climate change way beyond environmental aspects and highlighting the impacts that communities are facing. So it is the approach that we should be taking as we demand climate justice, and regions that are more affected. And again, speaking of Asia, which is the most populous and the most affected region, also has to play a role and lead the way in advocating for climate justice and protecting the rights of its most vulnerable people. So for us as the global community, we need to put those intergenerational rights and human rights at the center, come together and adopt various approaches. And of course, we are very inspired by the work that our Pacific leadership, we've seen how students and governments have come together and achieved this resolution. And now the process is on to get the advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. So we feel very energized and inspired by their leadership, and we in Asia have to join hands and make sure that we all come together and demand that global cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable insights on intergenerational equity and human rights-based climate action. Your expertise has illuminated key pathways towards sustainable and just future. Our next is Konasinghe, who is also one of the advisors for the World's Youth for Climate Justice Asian Front. Professor Konasinghe is the head of the Department of Public and International Law at the Faculty of Law of the University of Colombo. She is the founding director of the Center for Environmental Law and Policy, affiliated with the Faculty of Law. Professor Konasinghe is the national consultant to the upcoming Climate Change Act, National Environmental Act, and National Policy on Living Entities in Sri Lanka. She is a member of the Commonwealth Futures Climate Research Cohort 2021-2022 of the Association of Commonwealth Universities and has represented Sri Lankan official delegation at the United Nations Climate Change COP27 in Egypt, India. She was awarded the University of Colombo Senate Award for Research Excellence for Legal Studies in 2020. Professor Konasinghe has also represented Sri Lanka in producing the South Asian Report on Climate Change and Country Report on International Disaster Management Laws and Policies. She is known for her contribution in academia as a lecturer, researcher, and a conference chair. I can keep the list going, but I will stop for now and invite Kokila ma'am to conduct her speech. Today, she will be speaking on climate impact on protection of human rights, a legal analysis. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Dulki. Would it be all right if I share a PowerPoint? Would it be all right if I share a PowerPoint?
Yes, sure, ma'am.
All right. Okay. Ayubowan. I hope that everyone is safe and healthy wherever you are from, because the world is getting more and more into a messy place with climate change impacts. Therefore, I think it is a high time. Maybe we are a little bit late, but it is high time, I would say, to pay our attention on protecting the Mother Earth in whatever the way that we can. Therefore, first of all, let me appreciate the effort made by WYCJ as a youth group, and it is my pleasure helping out in whatever the small way I can. So with that note, let me move on to my presentation. And I will be speaking on climate impact on protection of human rights from a legal perspective. And we all know that climate change affect many aspects of human life and also fauna and flora ecosystem as a whole. So therefore, I have mentioned here right to life, health, food, property, private life, and freedom from torture, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment from very anthropocentric approach. But I should also emphasize from ecocentric approach, we know that the list goes on and it's a wider scope than what is appeared on the screen. And the world has made its efforts in different ways to face this challenge of climate change. Therefore, there are international instruments such as international human rights instruments and also international environmental instruments. And also, international institutions are there to oversee the functions and protection and promotion of environmental rights. Thirdly, there are international organizations, and also this should this should include the courts, international courts, and the climate litigation. And first, let me focus on international environmental law instruments. And from the Stockholm Declaration, if you look at the preamble of Stockholm Declaration and also Principle 1, mention about the link, the interlinkage between human rights protection, basically the main key human rights and its link with environmental protection. But then there have been many declarations and international instruments that talk about environmental protection in general. And in 1992, with the Rio conference, we see that the adaptation of UNFCCC. And UNFCCC in 1992, and it followed by, in 1997, by Kyoto Protocol as an action plan. The procedure is explained. But there were many issues and challenges with Kyoto Protocol. Later on, we have Paris Agreement in 2050. So Article 3 of UNFCCC explain the objectives of the convention, and the principle of intergenerational equity was emphasized in this article towards future generation is very much important if we all want to survive. And Kyoto Protocol, unfortunately, did not make it way through seeing the, but the main failure of Kyoto Protocol was actually the lack of support by the industrial world, which was actually instrumental in making Kyoto Protocol a success. But unfortunately, it was heavily influenced by the least support by the developed world, mainly by the United States. And then we had in 2015, Paris Agreement. And Paris Agreement, the main highlight in Paris Agreement was requesting for nationally determined contributions, NDCs, including both developed and developing countries. And then we have contemporary developments of at the global level, looking at climate change and human rights. And now I'm going to look at the international human rights documents. Unfortunately, during the earlier time of the human rights discourse, when we discuss about first generational rights, second generational rights, climate change matter was not very much in the highlights of the human rights discourse. Therefore, none of the main human rights, international human rights documents, Bill of Human Rights, mention anything in relation to climate change or environmental protection. But with the pressure coming from the environment and the changing of the weather patterns and extreme weather situations and the climate impacts, now the world has realized that climate change should be a prioritized area in the global agenda. Therefore, in 2008, United Nations Human Rights Council 7/23 states human rights and climate change determines climate change poses an immediate and overarching, far-reaching threat to people and communities around the world and has implications for full enjoyment of human rights. Now, with these resolutions, we can see many initiatives made by HRC. In 2009, also, we see this sort of development at the Human Rights Council, looking at climate change and the impact on human rights, particularly right to adequate food, right to the highest attainable standard of health, right to adequate housing, right to self-determination, so on and so on, so on and so forth. And then when you look at COP, Conference of Parties under UNFCCC and Human Rights Council come together at one point in 2010. The Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC adopted a decision quoting the statement in Human Rights Council Resolution 10/4. And this particular emphasis on human rights with climate change made many differences thereafter to most of the global forums on human rights. 2011 Office of High Commissioner on Human Rights report states that while the Universal Human Rights Treaties do not refer to a specific right to a safe and healthy environment, UN human rights treaty bodies all recognize the intrinsic link between the environment and realization of range of human rights such as right to life, health, food, water, and housing. And again, Human Rights Council in Resolution 38/4 in 2018 recognizes one of the main areas of climate impacts, that is on women and girl children. So it says that women and girl children are disproportionately affected by the negative impacts of climate change, and it emphasizes sudden onset natural disasters and slow onset events seriously affect their access to food and nutrition, safe drinking water, sanitation, healthcare services and medicine, education and training, and adequate housing and access to decent work. So this particular resolution, I think, raised one step ahead towards protecting vulnerable communities. In 2022, referring to 2021, the previous resolution, again, they emphasize that human connection between human rights and climate change. And also, in 2021, Human Rights Council adopted two historic resolutions. The first one is 48/13, and this recognize the human rights and the close relationship between climate impacts and human rights. So that is also that was adopted later on by the United Nations General Assembly in 2022. So Human Rights Council expressed their interest in looking at climate impacts through human rights perspective. And then later on in 2022, General Assembly passed a resolution recognizing the Human Rights Council resolution, again emphasizing the wider acceptance within the United Nations framework on climate and human rights. And if we look at the litigation, climate litigation also play a crucial role all over the world. We can remember that in Australia, Gloucestershire Resources Limited case, and also Planet B in United Kingdom, and Juliana versus United States in USA. This climate litigation paved the way for more and more interest in the civil society's general public in protecting climate change. Finally, my main attention goes to the recent judgments given by the European Court of Human Rights. So there are three main judgments I have mentioned on the screen, but this particular judgment was landmark in climate litigation, that is this Clima Signorinen case by Switzerland. Now, this case was filed by female senior citizens and their representative organization at the European Court of Human Rights. So the Strasbourg Court, referring the Article 34 of the European Convention on Human Rights, that the Switzerland failed to demonstrate the existence of a sufficient link between harm these senior citizens, elderly people going through, and they are allegedly suffered by the climate impact. Therefore, the European Court of Human Rights ordered Switzerland, and also it extends its serious concern over to all the European Union, the countries in the European Union, to take the necessary active engagement in implementing European Convention on Human Rights provisions in relation to the impacts made by climate change. So the violations of human rights and the seriousness of these heat waves and other climate-induced damages and what it caused to these elderly citizens was a serious concern by the European Court of Human Rights. So now we have come to a point that we can say that the very much interested paid by the courts, international courts, regional courts, as well as the international organizations, including the United Nations Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, make climate impacts towards human rights violations has become a very important issue and a crucial discussion in the global agenda today. Therefore, we can see future with some sort of a positive aspect, because the entire world, individually as states and civil societies, and also individuals in countries, now have realized the importance of protecting the atmosphere by climate change. Not only that, even the states have taken their steps forward for climate implementation of climate laws at the national levels. For example, now Sri Lanka is at the moment drafting Climate Change Act. Likewise, I know that many states making their platforms at the legislative, executive, and also judiciary to entertain the matters in relation to climate change. So let's hope for the best for the future. And I thank WYCJ for inviting me. And with that note, I conclude with some hope for the future, for the positive direction of implementing climate laws through executive, administrative, legislative, as well as through the judiciary through climate litigation. Thank you very much, Dulki. That's all from me. Ayubowan.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We are really grateful that you accepted our invitation to conduct this insightful session. We actually made the invitation today in the morning only, so really, really grateful, ma'am. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your valuable insights. And yes, we also hope that we will be able to make a difference, and we'll be able to make a difference soon. Thank you so much, ma'am. So our Q&A session will follow after the speakers have all spoken. And if you have any questions to ask, you can see there's a tab. Please type in and keep your questions ready. We will be asking them from our presenters once they are done with their presentations. Thank you so much again. So our next speaker is Mr. Dennis Mombauer, the Director for Research and Knowledge Management, Slycan Trust Global. His work focuses on ecosystem-based adaptation, sustainable development, climate migration, and other topics related to climate change. Today, he will focus on climate change and human rights with the focus on climate justice, human mobility, and livelihood. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me today to fill in on a short notice. Also, originally my colleague Rosita was supposed to speak today, but couldn't make it, so I'm trying to fill in. As maybe a short disclaimer, so she's a lawyer, I'm not, so I will try to focus on some of the legal aspects, but I will also go a bit more into the policy space and try to point out areas that need legal considerations without going into the legal technicalities. And great to see you, Harjeet, and Professor Kokila. It's great to be in good company here and talk about these topics. So as introduced, I work for Slycan Trust, which is a nonprofit think tank. We work on a number of topics that relate to this. Today, I would like to focus a bit on what was already slightly mentioned also by Harjeet, the issue of human mobility, which includes, under the CCC at least, migration, displacement, and then planned relocation. And so as already mentioned by the previous speakers, there are a number of different kinds of human rights, rights to food, to health, to life, to property, etc. And this is something that has been brought up in the climate space. For example, now in the Paris Agreement, there is a direct mention of human rights that calls on parties to respect, promote, and consider human rights when they're taking climate action. It's not mentioned in the CCC in the convention, but the Paris Agreement included it, and it was also acknowledged and to some extent highlighted in later conversations, for example, in the very recent outcome document from COP28, the UAE consensus. So as part of this taking climate action and also as part of climate impacts, human mobility can also pose a lot of different threats and risks to human rights and impact these different kinds of human rights that we already mentioned. For example, last year, the Human Rights Council at its 53rd session has a resolution 53/6, which talks about the risks, for example, of exploitation and trafficking, especially for women and girls, about forced movement, about human rights protection gaps in situations of migration and displacement, and also about the disproportionate impacts on youth, older persons, persons with disabilities, persons living in poverty, etc. And has also requested the Secretary General to consult member states and conduct and submit an analytical study on the impact of loss and damage from climate change. That's part of this resolution that I mentioned, and that will be submitted at the 57th session of the Human Rights Council, which is, I think, in September, October this year. So coming up quite quickly, and to look at how climate change, what adverse effects it has on the full enjoyment of human rights. And that includes in the situations of human mobility. So that can be the civil rights, political rights, economic, social, cultural rights. Where climate change had an impact on their decision to flee. So I'm talking more about migration that happens internally within countries. So there's a lot of displacement from disasters that we have seen in countries, especially also in the Asia-Pacific region, due to floods, due to storms, due to tidal waves and sea level impacts, but also a lot of long-term impacts that are leading to migration. For example, loss of agricultural yields, rising temperatures, affected livelihoods that lead to circular cyclical migration from rural areas into cities, but also sometimes permanent. It has been a factor in my decision-making around foreign employment and leaving countries, but also about rural and urban migration patterns from rural areas to urban areas, and also from rural to rural areas and other urban to urban migration patterns. And often cities are not really prepared to take in these migrants. Rural areas do not have the options to take, to provide like the necessary livelihoods if there's a huge influx. And we have also seen conflict around natural resources in countries, also in the context of planned relocation, which has a whole range of issues that can come up when it comes to human rights and their enjoyment by those who are being relocated, which is often a top-down decision-making process. So again, human rights and climate-related human mobility often intersect, and there are a lot of protection gaps, there are a lot of issues that can surround mobility. And this has been acknowledged by countries, for example, out of the national adaptation plan submitted so far to the UNFCCC, 83% make some reference to human mobility, 64% have relevant commitments or actions to address human mobility. And out of these, 1/4 is from the Asia-Pacific region. That's based on our research as like and trust. And what they have as commitments can be maybe grouped in different categories. So for example, a lot of them talk about data and knowledge gaps and how to close these, because a lot of the movement happens also informally or is not properly documented, and there's lack of disaggregated data on the household level, looking at how communities are affected, looking at the non-economic impacts of this mobility and what it makes, how it affects social cohesion, for example, and access to education, access to continuous healthcare. So that's one category. Then scenario development and anticipatory planning. Countries are planning in some instances for situations of mobility. Then the policy enabling environment. And then 3 categories of commitments, which are about protecting, supporting those who are on the move, the migrants, the displaced people, those being relocated. Then supporting in situ adaptation to prevent mobility that might be maladaptive or a form of loss and damage. And then utilizing mobility as an adaptation strategy, which can also often happen in the context of relocation, at least from the intention to have it as an adaptation measure to allow those who are not able to adapt in situ to adapt in other places. Again, this has a lot of potential issues and a lot of potential human rights implications and risks. And for all of these commitments and elements, human rights should be a key consideration. And it's really important to look at when we operationalize these, when countries in the region, but also worldwide, look at how to actually implement their NAPs and their NDCs, how human rights can be part of this. So there's a need for evidence, of course, but also for legal frameworks that address this informal nature of movement, that allow for voluntary mobility and also for voluntary immobility. So it's often called the right to remain. So not to not have to move if you are not voluntary wanting to move. So that is also a key consideration to look at this immobility aspect where people do not want to move, so they shouldn't be forced to move, which is also part of the freedom of movement, not move. Then to have regular mobility pathways where people who do want to move can move in safe ways, in orderly ways, in ways that guarantee their access to adequate standard of living, to proper housing, to sanitation, to services, utilities, that gives them access to livelihood and employment options, that allow for continuous access to healthcare, to food, to water, to education, especially here also intergenerational equity and the rights of youth and children come in, to have freedom of discrimination and risks that are based on gender. For example, in displacement, often there are safety issues related to shelter, to evacuation procedures, to how people are moving. Then the preservation of the social aspects, the cultural heritage, and also participation in public affairs. If people are moving informally, they're registered in different places, how can they vote? How are they be able to have a meaningful and informed participation in these systems, both in the formal systems of government or democracy or voting, but also into the informal systems that they are usually part of. And how can the movement also impact the right to a healthy environment? There's often, as I mentioned, conflict over natural resources, but also displacement and migration and relocation can lead to like a degradation of the natural ecosystems, to a loss of biodiversity, and then in turn that affects those who have been moved to these places. So how can we address these kinds of risks? So basically, that's just what I wanted to highlight as a key area to look at human rights. And I think it's also something mentioned in the request for the advisory opinion. And again, in the Human Rights Council resolution, as well as in the Paris Agreement and the discussions around this. How can we make sure that in situations of immobility, if we see it as a form of loss and damage, or if we see it as part of adaptation, or somewhere between both, that the approaches to address this are people-centered, that they're based on evidence, that they're rights-based, that human rights are guaranteed. What can be done at the municipal level? What can cities and municipal administrations do? What can the local government do? What is the role of the national government governing internal mobility? And then also, of course, what are the bi- and multilateral frameworks, the regional compacts for cross-border mobility, for regional policy coherence, and also at the global level, how it's integrated into the UNFCCC process, into other relevant frameworks, and how can we have a global coherence on these policies and also the means of implementation to actually operationalize them. And one last thing I wanted to mention in the COP28 outcome documents, the Global Stocktake or UAE consensus, there's also this call to improve coherence and synergies between efforts pertaining to different frameworks and processes, such as disaster risk reduction, humanitarian processes, rehabilitation, recovery, reconstruction, displacement, planned relocation, and migration, all in the context of climate change impacts. And I think that is really important if you look at mobility, because it does span all of these sectors. Human mobility is a question for those doing climate policy. For example, looking at in Sri Lanka, it's the Climate Act coming up, or it's the National Climate Policy, or at NDCs or NAPs, but also for disaster risk reduction, for the whole livelihoods and labor and employment issues, workplace protection, for example, for the health sector, for the social protection aspect of it, and also for looking at ecosystem conservation, biodiversity protection, and all these different considerations that come into play when we look at mobility. So to have a system that really brings in these different sectors and the different processes to address this in a evidence-based way, human rights protection into this, and make sure that we close the protection gaps for those who are on the move, who are among the most vulnerable, especially also the women, the children, those with disabilities, the elderly, but really everyone affected by mobility where they might not have the ability to have full access to their rights. And with that, I would close it, and very happy to have also interactive discussion and answer any questions on any of these aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for that insightful discussion. And Once again, thank you very much for accepting our invitation on such short notice. And we are really looking forward to having a very interactive question and answer session. So our next speaker is Miss Christine Joy Argolon, who's joining us from the Philippines. She teaches natural resources and environmental law at the University of Cebu School of Law in Cebu, Philippines. She is also the supervising lawyer for the Green Legal Clinic of the University of Cebu Legal Aid and Law Center, Inc. Currently, she is the Legal and Policy Officer of the Philippine Earth Justice Center, a Cebu-based environmental NGO working on the implementation and full enforcement of environmental laws in the Philippines. She works with local communities, providing capacity building and mentorship to local paralegals and provides litigation support to communities affected by environmental law violations. Over to you. Thank you. Was I not audible? Sorry.
Hi, sorry. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I was just having some technical difficulty earlier. So thank you so much again for to WYCJ for the invitation. It's my first time being in this global discussion regarding climate change and the human rights aspect. So I'm here to share a little bit about the civil society efforts on environmental protection, some of the case studies on a little bit of what's happening in the Philippines, especially that earlier during the introduction, we do a lot of community-based activities. So we do work a lot with civil society organizations and also communities affected by environmental issues. So the issue on human rights pertaining to how it affects local communities, people's organization is also very important to our organization. So again, our organization, the Philippine Earth Justice Center, we're based in Cebu, Philippines. It's in the central part of the Philippines. Just a bit of a background so that, you know, before I share also some of the work that we do, we were founded in 2010 because of a case of an oil exploration case that happened in one of the largest marine protected seascape in central Philippines. And our founding lawyers made it a point to help local communities, especially fisherfolk organizations along the two islands of Cebu and Negros. And this was this is now a landmark case in the Philippines, because this was also the case where environmental lawyers in the Philippines wanted to test whether the Philippines would now be open to allowing non-human petitioners or plaintiffs in the Supreme Court of the Philippines. So if you notice, the case title is The Resident Mammals of Tanyon Strait against the Secretary of the Department of Energy in the Philippines. So that was decided by the Supreme Court in 2015, and it ruled that although it didn't give legal standing to resident mammals, the dolphins and these marine cetaceans in the Philippines, but at that time, we would consider this a win because the Supreme Court pronounced that based on the rules of procedure for environmental cases that is currently in place in the Philippines, this allows citizen suit, allowing Filipinos to file an action before our courts in cases of violations of our environmental law. So this is very important, especially in the jurisprudence in the Philippines, because it now gives us the right, Filipino citizens in representation of communities and other sectors to bring an action before the courts in cases of violations of our environmental laws. And the environmental laws in the Philippines are founded on the two basic environmental rights, constitutional environmental rights under the 1987 Constitution. So here, it provides the Constitution of the Philippines provides the right to health and the right to a balanced and healthful ecology, which are basic constitutional rights of every Filipino. So in cases of violations of environmental rights of every Filipino, so they could use this as a basis. So we've actually utilized these provisions. Sorry for the noise, for the background noise. I'm currently at the airport, but I hope that my audio is still clear. But we've been using these two provisions in several cases that we've filed in the Supreme Court, highlighting that environmental rights are closely linked to human rights of every Filipinos. And right now, this was also, we also like to highlight that the UNGA resolution reiterated that we already have the right to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment. So this just strengthens the constitutional basis of the different environmental rights in the Philippines, in the case of the Philippines. And so the legal and policy framework allows us to exact accountability from our public officials. So civil society organizations and people's organizations have been fighting again, not just against private corporations, but also exacting accountability from local governments, especially if these have been mandated under their under the agency, because it's very important that there are human rights safeguards in each of our environmental laws in the Philippines, and also that transparency, accountability, and participation are also core values or core principles that we also emphasize under the Philippine environmental laws. So again, emphasizing on the rights of the local government units, which different civil society organizations have been using, since local government units under the Local Government Code of the Philippines, they have the mandate to be responsible in the management and the maintenance of the ecological balance within their territorial jurisdiction. So for example, some of the many cases, not just for us, not just for our organizations, but many other organizations in the country that are currently facing. We've been facing a lot of developmental aggression and coastal development and commercialization of the coast. So the Philippines is surrounded by waters. So a lot of the marine resources, coastal resources, are a threat because of commercialization and extractive activities that are happening within our coast. So very important that when we bring cases or we bring complaints before our local government units, we emphasize that they have the responsibility to maintain the ecological balance, which includes the protection of the natural resources within the coast, or from not just from the coast, but also from the mountains and different other natural resources. So because of the different campaigns by civil society organizations, we have sought the help of the Department of Interior and local government to issue this memorandum circular that allows for local that urges local government units that before they allow for certain activities to be approved within their territorial jurisdiction, that they must comply with the Philippine Environmental Impact Assessment system. Of course, we all know the EIA laws. And so it's very important that we emphasize and we always remind our local government units regarding the requirements or the mandates that they have to follow following the environmental impact assessment, so that we are able to protect not just the environment, but also the people that live within those sectors. So part of that memorandum circular is really to make sure that every project must be consistent with the different plans and projects of each local government unit. So these are not just randomly approved projects, and they must ensure that they must ensure public participation of the different stakeholders. And these local government units are required to attest that the requirements under the, not just the environmental impact statement laws, but also other environmental laws are met. So this is a very important tool that we have been using in terms of the fight, our campaigns on environmental protection, because this gives civil society and people's organization a voice that they would be able to participate, or not just, we're not just calling for a seat at the table in terms of public participation, but really being able to be but for local civil society organizations, people's organizations to be heard in terms of these decision making and public participation activities. So these are just some of the things that we've been working, issues regarding assault on the mountains, tree cutting, expansion, reclamation. But we have also made it a point that part of the civil society organization is to build networks and coalitions in the ground and involve different types of civil society organizations from the academe, from the church, from the youth sector, so that we'll have a multi-sectoral voice and a representation in each of the decision-making bodies that we are trying to engage with. So we're talking about, we're not just talking about reclamation and coastal development, but we're also talking about issues relating to incineration, especially that in the Philippines, and I know that this isn't just an issue in the Philippines, that there have been a lot of waste-to-energy incineration projects that have been proposed because of poor solid waste management issues with our local government units, so that we are able to protect our people. And the current threat right now is the amendment. I think in the Philippines, we currently have a ban on incineration. So, which is why we always campaign from the civil society organizations that we must ensure that incineration should not be allowed because of the current ban under the Philippine Clean Air Act. And so different concerns that have been raised by civil society organizations, again, really an issue on social acceptability and the participation in decision-making bodies, the socioeconomic impacts to the surrounding communities, what happens to the people or the communities that will be displaced, and also the health impact of the residents in the community. Again, emphasizing that the right to a balanced and healthful ecology is closely linked to the right to health of the people. And of course, financial burdens for local government units and the different other environmental impacts. So these are the things that we emphasize when we try to engage with civil society organizations and try to build a strong network of support. And the support from the different coalitions and networks that we've been working with in terms of environmental protection, we always make sure that science is at the heart of the decision-making, policy-making bodies. So scientists, we've invited different scientists, marine biologists, and experts so that they would be able to give us data and information that will help us assess and give policy recommendations to our local government units. So stakeholder engagement is really providing for spaces of dialogue within our within the NGOs, within the local government units, and not just local government units, but also national government units, the national government. So these are just some of the photos of the work that we do with communities, emphasizing that, although, the issue on climate change and human rights could be such an abstract issue to local, to fisher folks or to farmers, but we try to make it a point that we share this information with them that they will be able to understand it and appreciate it, how it affects their day-to-day life, and how it will affect the future of their children and their grandchildren. So that's when the people get involved in the decision making and in the campaigns that we do within the local communities. One important thing that we also like to emphasize in the campaigns with civil society organizations is also this tool that we created together with Oceana, the Environmental Alliance Worldwide, and the Environmental Legal Assistance Center here in different civil society organizations in the Philippines, is the Citizen Scorecard, which is a self-assessment tool to help enhance accountability for the different local government units and the different projects. So we made it a point that this will be an empowerment tool for the different people in the community. So the photos that you saw earlier were photos of us actually rolling out the citizen scorecard. If these if the people could easily answer it based on what they know about a certain project that or the certain proposal that's happening within their local community. So we've also translated it to local language to help people give them the power to be involved in the decision making. So some of the points or the indicators in the citizen scorecard that we always emphasize is the different highlights of an EIA project, or the different highlights under the different regulations under the different Philippine environmental laws. So questions in terms of location, questions in terms of project consultations, public participation, the implementation and the monitoring. These are very important tools so that everyone is involved in the decision making process. So one other thing that I'd like to emphasize is that in the Philippines also we have the rules of procedure for environmental cases, which is a separate set of cases, separate set of rules for civil, criminal, and special civil action pertaining to enforcement or violations of the different environmental laws in the Philippines. So why is this a very important tool? Because some of the features or the salient features of the RPEC is the rights-based approach, emphasizing, how we should take into consideration, the people aspect, and also the writ of kalikasan or the writ of nature, which I'll go later. So the rights-based approach is very important, is a very important paradigm or approach because it allows us to facilitate the administration of environmental justice, taking into consideration the rights of the people vis-a-vis the environment. And this again, jumping off from the case of the resident mammals case, that really allows people to take action so that they would ensure a healthy environment, and the same way that they could seek judicial remedies for violations or civil in the same way that they could seek judicial relief for violations of their civil and judicial rights. So also, very important to highlight the Oposa versus Factorian case, which is a landmark case emphasizing intergenerational responsibility. So we always make sure that, when we talk about the environment and environmental rights to people, we're talking about the right to, the right to self-perpetuation and self-preservation among the people. So these are constitutionally guaranteed and fundamental human rights of the people. So we always emphasize that, there is always an opportunity to take part in decision making, and the people must be at the center of the decision making process. And so in the writ of kalikasan, it is a relief that where the constitutional rights, which I mentioned, the right to health and the right to a balanced health and healthful ecology, when these are being threatened with violation or they're actually violated, then we could already file a case with the Supreme Court of the Philippines. If it affects a of the gravity, if it's at a level that affects the right life, health, and property of people within 2 or more cities or provinces. Although at present it's currently being reviewed in terms of the procedural requirements, but then again, the writ of kalikasan is one of the remedies that's available under the Philippine laws, which have been currently being utilized by different civil society organizations. So it's very important that we have that. And one other thing, I know that this is just a climate justice story of the Philippines, and I know some of you may have heard of this already, but just to quickly close the discussion relating to environmental rights and human rights. The story of the CHR, or the Commission on Human Rights investigation relating to the carbon majors of the 47 fossil fuel companies, a threat of violating human rights in the Philippines, especially because of the impacts of climate change. It's a story that's close to the heart of the Filipinos, because these are stories and lived experiences of people that have experienced the wrath of typhoons and have, they were not able to exercise or enjoy their human rights because of the impacts the impacts of climate change. And so what are the implications, or what are the national and the global implications of the human rights case? So of course, the issue the main position is that the carbon majors, because of their continued activities, have been violating, infringing, and abusing human rights of the different of the people. And of course, the response of that the carbon majors was that, you know, it was a matter outside of the realm of civil and political rights under the Constitution of the Philippine Human Rights Commission. These fossil fuels did not operate within the Philippines territory. But what is the national and global implication of this report, which was released late last year? It's not just it really emphasizes the use of science, and it is a valuable tool for assessing the data, the information in assessing the impacts of climate change, the different activities of fossil fuel companies and how it impacts the rights of different people of the Filipinos. And I think not just for the Filipinos, but many other persons in different different territories that have been affected by the continued use of fossil fuel. And of course, the report, the National Human Rights Report, could be a roadmap for pending or future climate actions, not just for the Philippines, but also globally. Although right now, there's still, as far as I know, there's still no actual case that's being filed against the Philippine government for its violations of its rights. Yes, and so very important to have this tool for every Filipinos. And lastly, how can civil society organizations take action? And from the experience that we have here in the Philippines, again, important is to tell a story and inform the people about key environmental issues and how people can, different legal interventions that can be used or utilized by the different communities, that change policies, programs, and behaviors, or engage with different organizations or youth sectors, and strategic communications and utilizing science and campaigns for the different civil society organizations. So I think that's my last slide. So different civil society organizations really could just come together, and this is one way, sharing the different stories from different jurisdictions, from different areas, so that we'll learn from each other, and also adapt and use that different learnings within our local community. So thank you so much to WYCJ for this invitation, and I'm very happy to be able to answer different some questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Argalon. I really, really liked your presentation. It shows a success story of how civil societies can make a difference and can lead the way to environmental protection. And thank you so much for joining us despite being in the airport. Thank you so much. So our next speaker, who's going to be the last speaker of this session, is Ms. Nicole Ann Ponsa, who's an environmental activist and human rights lawyer advocate from the Philippines. She holds degrees in political science and law, and she's particularly interested in the interface between law, policy, and science. She currently works at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, the French National Institute for Scientific Research in Paris, as a research engineer and project manager. I hope I pronounced it correct, Nicole. And also she serves as the Asian Front convener for WYCJ and is part of the Global Steering Committee. Most of her efforts are focused on obtaining an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice relating to human rights in the face of climate crisis. And I would say that she is the driving force of the Asian Front of the World's Youth for Climate Justice. Nicole will discuss about the role of youths in human rights-based climate action. Over to you, Nicole.
Thank you for your kind words, Tuke. Couldn't do it without you. I'm going to make my intervention quick. We had some of the amazing panel discussions earlier on, and we have a few questions for our panelists. So just to speak a bit on the role of youth, I want to share this story about 2 years ago, along with my friends here from PISFCC. I had the opportunity to take part in a conference at the Peace Palace for an ICJ advisory opinion. So that's 2022, and it's amazing to look back on it and see how far our stubborn optimism has brought us. And I remember this vividly because at that time, my hometown here in Cebu was devastated by a super typhoon that crippled our highly urbanized city overnight. So in the aftermath of super typhoon Atet, an entire city, much like what's happening in Bangladesh right now, no electricity, no signal, no drinking or utility water, and phones were useless basically. So from worrying then if I could finish my course outline for the bar exam, I had to stake out by the road, waiting for the government's ration, drinking water and food. So this lasted for months for many people. And it's really quite eye-opening how everything pales in comparison when you're faced with our own mortality. And I often go back to this experience because I've since met young people from our region who had to live through similar experience on a daily basis. So I've met our members in Colombo, in Kathmandu, and of course our friends from Pakistan, and how they were devastatingly hit by destructive floods. A third of their country was submerged underwater. And also this summer, massive heat waves hit the Philippines schools. And so, schools were forced to cancel classes. And then it begs the question, to what extent does this loss affect the rights of children when they're not able to attend school? So for so many of us, we are forced to adapt and fend for ourselves because we don't have a choice. And the sad thing is we are hit disproportionately too. Vulnerable communities, women and children. But if there is a takeaway or something I want to emphasize, is that this is not how we want our story to be. And I think what we're doing is with WYCJ and PISFCC is really change that narrative and change that story for all of us. So in the last year or so, our youth representatives from Sri Lanka were actively involved in Sri Lanka state submission before the ICJ, advocating principles of intergenerational equity in the drafting of the submission. And their government has acknowledged and recognized their contribution in this process. We have our youth from Nepal who organized themselves and together drafted a youth brief that they shared and was taken into consideration by the government of Nepal in their submission before the ICJ. And we also have the Philippine submission highlighting the landmark children's case of the Philippines, again, where intergenerational equity was equated to the fundamental right to a balanced and healthy ecology, and provided remedies as well, such as our writ kalikasan, which Joy shared earlier. So this is how we rewrite our narrative. And the good news is now we have a recourse in international law with our waves of advisory opinions. So in preparing state submissions before the ICJ, we have youth on the ground advocating for intergenerational equity and progressive arguments connecting climate change to human rights, coupled with specific points of national interest in cognizance of domestic perspective and context. Truly, this is a pivotal year for human rights and climate justice as our leading international courts turn their attention to this crisis. So thank you very much, and I'll give it back to Duque for some really interesting questions.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So we only have about exactly 15 minutes left for the Q&A session. So I will start off with one of my own questions that I have come across when we are promoting our campaign. I would like to know from our experts. So this is our experience when we are promoting about the advisory opinion that we can get from the International Court of Justice. Many people ask, okay, so an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice is not domestically enforceable. And what difference is it going to make? So I would love to know your thoughts on how we can address this question and how we can better provide answers for such questions when people are asking what difference an advisory opinion can make. Thank you. This is an open question to any of the speakers. Maybe Mr. Harjeet Singh, if he likes to take it, or
Sure, Dulki. I can start, and it was my pleasure to also support this campaign as part of my engagement with Climate Action Network and also now with Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Despite those concerns, I think that advisory opinion, if once we are able to secure, it's going to be a landmark and a very important tool for us in our fight for climate justice. For a number of reasons. One, what it is asking for is legal clarity. And getting legal clarity from the highest court is going to be so important for all courts around the world to take guidance from. And that is going to inspire many more such decisions in countries and at various levels. So I think that legal clarity is going to be extremely important. Second, it will also strengthen the litigation movement that we are seeing. As I said in my opening remarks, that has multiplied, and understanding with that clarity that this is going to be one of the important tools as part of our toolkit, again, it's going to strengthen that. And then because this advisory opinion is going to focus and center around human rights and intergenerational rights, that also strengthens our argument and also gives a boost to our fight. And of course, the ongoing policy work gets informed around that. But the most important thing, and some of the folks are there, and Vishal in particular may remember, I was probably one of the first ones who said, let's turn advisory opinion into a public opinion. That is our responsibility. Once you get that, how do you take it to masses? How do you then talk about it and make everybody aware the power of that and not the weakness? Because that's what international court offers us. So it's going to inspire that the existing climate justice movement and young people. I think that's the message that we have to take to masses once we get the opinion.
Thank you so much, sir. Professor Kokila, ma'am, would you like to add something? Yes, thank you.
Yes, following from Harjeet, I think I also can add a little bit more about what kind of acceptance that we are expecting from the global south or global north when we get an opinion from ICJ. And first of all, we should look at what is ICJ, that is International Court of Justice. So we have been trying everyone's best at the national level, local level, regional level. Now I have given you a series of cases. So did Christina gave her list of cases where national courts and regional courts have made their effort. Now we should go to the next level. So I think WYCJ taking this matter to ICJ itself shows that now we are going to the global level, international level from litigation perspective. We have done our part at UNFCCC, COP, IPCC, all the international forums. But as I told you that it's not only sufficient. We should have some sort of a definition, interpretation by a legal authority. So that is what you are going to do. And that will be a huge contribution for the entire world thereafter when you have, as Harjeet said, legal clarity, legal definition on what are the parameters, how do we look at, and what are the steps we should take, and what is the responsibility of the youth. All of these really matters. And if you look at the ICJ history, if you look at nuclear weapon test IC advisory opinion, and there are many advisory opinions expressed by the ICJ previously which have had enormous impact of global security, global environmental protection. So we cannot deny the fact that the impact that can made by having a legal clarity or a definition by the ICJ, because the entity itself is an international court of justice. So I think now we have tried with the UN from the diplomatic and international relations perspective. Now we are going to the legal and the litigation at the global level. So for that, you are having this the global World Youth for Climate Justice campaign. So we are supporting that as researchers, academics, and the civil society. So this is kind of a network and a very wide audience that we are taking up to the ICJ. So we never can underestimate that effort. And I think that will be going down to the history that if we can get a proper and well accepted and serving intergenerational equity purpose kind of a definition. So yes, that's my answer, Dulki.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Professor. Really means a lot. Mr. Dennis Mumbawe, would you like to add, or shall we go to the next question?
No, I think Harjeet and Professor Kukula have answered this very nicely. I don't think there's much that needs to be added. I would just maybe say one thing, that this is, of course, it's not mutually exclusive from the policy process. So it's definitely also a good tool to advance the negotiations and also policy work at both the national and international level. But definitely, I think otherwise I agree with what the other two speakers have already outlined. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Nicole, over to you to ask the next question. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Duke. Yeah, thank you, Harjeet, for answering that question extremely well. We also have a question here that I thought was really interesting, and I'm gonna try to merge the two because because we don't have much time left. But I thought it would be interesting for our panelists to address this a bit. So the question is, what is the difficulty of merging the climate science with legal heavy initiatives? And perhaps in relation to that would be when we talk about granting refugee status to climate refugees, do you have any thoughts on what should be the threshold or the severity that must be met to be considered a refugee? And does it only extend to natural disasters? Because I've given very interesting example, like the case study that happened, one of a Bangladeshi national that was granted asylum, the first one in France, because he argued that his rights were affected due to the worsening quality of air pollution in his country. And he actually won and was given asylum status in France. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that case. And yeah, I just want to put it out there because I've heard some points raised about using science as well, climate science in our campaign, in our initiatives. So whoever would like to take that on.
Nicole, are you addressing this to any specific panelist, or it's an open one?
It's an open one. Sorry. Yes. Anyone who'd like to take on that question? Any thoughts?
Well, I can add on. I could probably start. In terms of climate science, I think working on the environmental law sector, we've always been really closely linked to science. So I think we can't speak about water quality, air quality, or climate and different types of natural ecosystems without talking about science. So climate science has been one of what we're currently also working with an organization that's working on climate science, translating what the NIRC, the National Philippine Human Rights Commission petition, the implications of that in the Philippines. So it's very important to always listen to science, and how the challenges probably of like merging it or marrying the two items, especially on the legal side. For the Philippines, there's not much experts, I guess I would say. We're still closely reliant on foreign experts. And so the difficulty is like bringing them and getting them to testify in terms of some of the cases that we're doing domestically. And I think I could probably share this, although I'm not part of that the original Greenpeace petition in the Philippines, but it was really like a pool of scientists from all over the world that really shared their their studies and their findings regarding the impacts of climate change to the enjoyment of the rights, especially of the Filipinos that have been affected by, you know, Super Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, which really like which was really like the jump off point because of the human rights inquiry. But in terms of you know, that's just one of the challenge. But I think because of the you know, environmental law and the climate litigation processes has been quite progressive and very open. So I think it's just a matter of really presenting it and putting it together, that the courts would really listen to the science and to that aspect. But yeah, I think once that challenge of, you know, bringing in experts and scientists is overcome, then I think that it would be easier and, you know, bring in different sectors, different you know, civil society and other sectors of the society to really translate that into you know, more realistic, more practical policy base, then that could really work with in terms of the legal strategies or the legal challenges. I think that's for me.
Thank you so much, Christine. If our other speakers would also like to quickly address this question, we have about 2 minutes left.
I will give you a quick point if you want to take it up. That is now, this is where, I mean, very much clearly visible North-South dimension, because the global South is lack of this scientific research and also technical support. So I think additional scientific expertise and technical support should be coming from the North. So common but differentiated responsibility and intra-generational equity principle is very much visible in this science matter, what you raised. So I think it is very, very essential that the scientific proof and evidence, if you want to argue in line of precautionary principle and polluter pays principle, common but differentiated responsibilities, all of these international environmental law concepts and principles should be very much based and founded on scientific evidence. So this is multidisciplinary approach. I mean, there's no argument about that. Law alone or political science or other policies alone cannot achieve this matter. In the North-South context, definitely the northern part of the world has more responsibility of transferring science and technology to the global South, and also Lausanne damage. All of these arguments are very much interconnected with this argument about science. Thank you. Just a quick point.
Yes, thank you so much for raising that important point, ma'am. Would any other speakers want to share their thoughts?
Let me
We have
say
1
one
minute.
very quick point, building on what Ms. Kokila and Ms. Christine mentioned. Definitely science has evolved, and there's a lot that we can draw from it, but we should not only depend on science, because in some cases it continues to evolve, particularly attribution science. But at the same time, we should also combine it with the historical inequities that have been caused by colonialism and extractivism. If we only depend on science and see the impact of climate change in a very siloed way, then we are not looking at what made those people vulnerable in the first place. So we need to, science is just another layer when we talk about demanding justice. But the reality is that, and as Ms. Kokila said, the global North and global South, I think that context is extremely important. What made global South vulnerable in the first place is the, you know, centuries of colonization and extractivism that happened. And of course, we have seen racism and many other such impacts on people. So just wanted to bring that layer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, our esteemed speakers. I would love to continue this discussion, but unfortunately, our session has to end now. So I would again would like to thank Mr. Harjeet Singh, Professor Kokila Konasinghe, Mr. Dennis Mumbawa, and Miss Christine Joy Argalon, and of course Miss Nicole Anponsa for joining us today and sharing their insights and experiences on human rights violations in the context of climate justice and applicable laws. Our session will continue at 2:30 p.m. IST. The next region that will be taking over is the South African region, and there will be panelists joining from South Africa. And I would really like to invite you to stay tuned because there's a lot of other interesting discussions happening soon. Thank you so much and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you for your time.